Amid the bustling heart of the city, the Magnolia Lux Hotel stood as a glittering gem. The towering building, with its glass facade reflecting the sunlight, housed interiors illuminated by exquisite crystal chandeliers imported from Italy. The entrance was lined with white marble tiles, accented by purple orchid arrangements refreshed daily. The grand lobby exuded a gentle fragrance from French-scented candles, while its walls were adorned with classic oil paintings that evoked an air of luxury. Behind the resounding success of this hotel was Daniel Blackwood, a reserved and affluent black entrepreneur. He had overcome countless hardships, rising from a young man in a poor neighborhood to the owner of a chain of luxury hotels spanning the country. To him, Magnolia Lux was more than just a building. It symbolized perseverance, determination, and a relentless pursuit of breaking the barriers society had placed upon him. Daniel was usually seen clad in finely tailored suits, a white gold Rolex adorning his wrist, embodying the aura of a powerful man. But today, he chose a faded gray sweater, old jeans, and worn sneakers. For the first time in years, he entered his hotel stripped of the grandeur of ownership. Daniel understood that true luxury wasn't about appearances, but how every guest was welcomed, whether they arrived in expensive suits or simple attire. He intended to test whether his staff genuinely treated all guests equally. Before stepping into the grand lobby, Daniel paused outside, watching the stream of people on the street. He reflected on his early days, working tirelessly and borrowing small amounts to bring his dream to life. Every brick of Magnolia Lux was a testament to his sweat, tears, and unwavering belief that persistence could overcome prejudice. But today was no ordinary day. Today, he was just an ordinary customer, an unannounced, seemingly powerless and anonymous man. He wanted to experience his hotel from an entirely different perspective, not through detailed reports or glowing online reviews. As he crossed the automatic glass doors, Daniel immediately felt the shift from the bustling street to the tranquil ambience of the hotel. The gentle sound of footsteps on marble floors, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting on the ceiling, and the faint strains of piano music created an atmosphere of perfect elegance. But Daniel wasn't here to savor perfection. He sought to uncover the shadows beneath the polish, the truths hidden in plain sight. No one paid attention to the man with the unassuming appearance. The receptionists remained busy attending to well-dressed guests, sparing him no more than a fleeting glance. Daniel smiled faintly and quietly approached the front desk, wondering what the day would reveal about his staff, the operations, and the values he had worked so hard to instill. As Daniel neared the reception desk, he immediately noticed the indifferent gaze of the receptionist. Andrew, a young white man dressed neatly in his uniform, with hair slicked back with gel, lacked the sophistication required of a high-end hotel employee. His eyes skimmed over Daniel, barely lingering a second, as if the man before him wasn't worth genuine attention. "Can I help you?" Andrew asked, his tone stiff and cold, devoid of the courtesy or professionalism expected in his role. He didn't smile or attempt to mask his wariness, as if Daniel's presence was a nuisance. Daniel smiled gently, though disappointment stirred within him. Maintaining his composure, he replied in a calm tone, "I'd like to book a room. Could you check for availability?" Andrew gave a perfunctory nod, avoiding further eye contact. He lowered his gaze to the keyboard, typing lazily. His demeanor made it clear he wasn't genuinely checking anything. "Sorry, we're fully booked," Andrew quickly said, his tone impatient, as though eager to end the interaction. Daniel stood still, his gaze fixed on Andrew, searching for even a shred of sincerity in his words. All he found was indifference, a quiet prejudice he had encountered far too often. He wasn't surprised. As the hotel's owner, Daniel was well aware of room availability, knowing there were still vacancies in both standard and premium categories. Calmly, he responded, "I made a reservation earlier. Could you check again?" Andrew hesitated for a moment, raising an eyebrow as if to question whether someone like Daniel could afford such a luxurious hotel. He sighed audibly, signaling his annoyance, and moved the mouse sluggishly over the screen. His movements were slow and disinterested, as though Daniel were wasting his valuable time. "I don't see any reservations under your name," Andrew replied curtly, his tone growing more dismissive. "We're full." Daniel nodded, making no attempt to leave. He didn't need to say more to understand the rejection wasn't due to a lack of rooms, but something deeper, a judgment based on his appearance, a silent decision to dismiss someone who didn't fit the mold of their typical guest. Straightening his posture, Daniel glanced around the reception area. It was then he noticed another figure. Rebecca, the floor manager, stood nearby, her gaze occasionally darting toward him. Rebecca was a woman in her mid-30s, impeccably dressed, exuding professionalism. Yet when her eyes met Daniel's, there was something unsettling, a silent yet unmistakable judgment. Rebecca approached Andrew, leaning in to whisper something in his ear, though her voice was loud enough for Daniel to hear. "I don't think he's our kind of guest. Just deal with it quickly." The words cut into Daniel's pride like a sharp blade. He was no stranger to this feeling. As a black man, he had endured countless glances like these, eyes filled with prejudice, whispers laden with judgment. But to hear it within the walls of the hotel he had poured his soul into was a pain he hadn't anticipated. Andrew turned back to Daniel, now emboldened by Rebecca's comment. His gaze held a hint of defiance. Perhaps her words had validated his decision. "I told you, we don't have any rooms," Andrew emphasized, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should try somewhere else." This time, Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stood there, looking directly at Andrew, his gaze steady, not angry, but resolute. In that moment, he realized this wasn't merely a small confrontation with an unprofessional employee. It was a larger test, a test of the very system he had painstakingly built, a test of his ideals of fairness and hospitality. Rebecca stepped back, crossing her arms, her expression a blend of skepticism and faint amusement. Daniel didn't need her to say more. Her silent judgment had spoken volumes. "I'll wait," Daniel said simply, his voice calm yet firm. He stepped aside, choosing a small corner of the lobby to observe. Andrew and Rebecca exchanged knowing glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Daniel knew he was the subject of their exchange. The atmosphere in the lobby grew heavier, as if his presence were a disruption. A problem they needed to solve quickly. Daniel sat down, his eyes observing their every move. From the avoiding glances to the whispered remarks, he felt their subtle hostility. But Daniel didn't react hastily. He understood that to uncover the truth, one often had to wait for it to reveal itself fully. And in this test of patience, he knew that waiting, though difficult, would be his greatest strength. Rebecca walked toward Daniel, the sharp click of her high heels on the marble floor echoing with authority. Each step seemed to assert her dominance. She stopped in front of him, chin slightly raised, her cold, judgmental gaze fixed on him. Daniel could see the demeanor of someone accustomed to giving orders and disliking being questioned. "Sir," she said, her tone a mix of authority and subtle mockery, "as I've already mentioned, we have no rooms available. Perhaps you should try finding another hotel that might be more suitable." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stood upright, his hand resting lightly on the reception desk, his eyes locking with Rebecca's. In that moment, without words, he could feel the disdain veiled in her words. "In that case," Daniel said calmly, his tone steady, "may I sit in the lobby for a bit? I need to make a call to arrange alternative accommodations." Rebecca hesitated for a moment. Perhaps part of her recognized that his request wasn't unreasonable, but the other part, the part that judged Daniel by his appearance, made her uncomfortable. After a few tense seconds, she reluctantly nodded. "Fine, but don't stay too long," she replied, her tone making it clear she wanted him gone as soon as possible. Daniel offered a faint smile, a silent thank you, and stepped aside. He chose a leather sofa near the corner of the lobby, a spot that offered a clear view of the space. While maintaining his composure, he couldn't ignore the scrutinizing glances from the staff or the whispered comments behind his back. He sat down, quietly opening his phone. Before he could make any call, the figures of two burly men appeared in his line of sight. Two hotel security guards, one tall with a stern face named Victor, the other slightly shorter but powerfully built, approached him with purpose. Victor stopped in front of Daniel, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was firm. "Sir, you can't stay here for too long. This isn't a place to loiter." Daniel looked up, meeting Victor's gaze. Gone was the mild, patient expression he'd worn earlier. His response was calm but resolute, each word deliberate. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." The second guard, Mark, standing beside Victor, smirked dismissively, clearly unconvinced by Daniel's words. "Sir, this is a high-end hotel. If you don't have business here, we'll have to ask you to leave," Mark said, his tone laced with condescension. Daniel remained seated. He could feel the tension rising, but he chose not to back down. "I've requested to sit here for a moment. I'm not disturbing anyone. If there's a hotel policy that forbids me from sitting here, perhaps you can show it to me." Victor hesitated at Daniel's calm demeanor, but Mark, less patient than his colleague, stepped forward. He lowered his voice, almost threatening. "If you don't leave now, we'll have to take other measures, and I'm sure you don't want that to happen." Across the lobby, Rebecca stood at a distance, watching the situation unfold. Her expression briefly betrayed uncertainty, but she quickly returned to her usual cold demeanor. She didn't intervene, as if waiting to see how far things would escalate. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling anger simmer within him, but he knew staying composed was crucial to handling the situation. He stood up, facing the two guards directly. "What are you planning to do? Use force to remove me? There are cameras here, and I'm certain this hotel doesn't want additional trouble." Victor and Mark hesitated, but Mark, unwilling to yield, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, signaling that it was time for him to leave. At that moment, Daniel pushed Mark's hand away, his eyes steely and unyielding. "Don't touch me," Daniel said, his voice low but commanding. The entire lobby fell silent. A few other guests, who had initially ignored the scene, now turned their attention to it. Rebecca appeared conflicted, but still refrained from stepping in. Victor, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, turned to look at Rebecca for guidance. But before she could say anything, Daniel spoke, his voice echoing through the grand lobby. "Miss Rebecca, I'd like to ask, why am I being treated this way? What have I done to deserve being regarded as someone unworthy of being here by your staff?" Daniel's words struck the tense atmosphere like a hammer. Every gaze in the lobby now shifted to Rebecca. She appeared momentarily flustered, but quickly composed herself and approached with her usual detached tone. "Sir, if you feel uncomfortable, we are more than willing to assist you in finding another hotel." Daniel gave a faint, bitter smile, one that couldn't mask his disappointment. He chose not to argue further, stepping back and folding his arms as he looked at them all directly. He knew this wasn't over, and now he was waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth, a truth that would completely upend the atmosphere in the hotel. Victor took another step forward, reaching out, preparing to grab Daniel's arm and force him out. But before anyone could act, Daniel's deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. "Stop! Do you know who I am?" The authority in his voice reverberated through the lobby, freezing the already taut atmosphere. Every movement ceased abruptly, and confused, curious eyes turned toward Daniel. Victor and Mark paused, their hands hanging midair. Rebecca, standing behind them, looked both startled and puzzled. "And who exactly are you?" Mark asked, his smirk widening, laced with derision, as though he couldn't believe the unassuming man before him could be anyone of significance. Daniel didn't reply immediately. Instead, he slowly reached into his coat pocket, retrieving his wallet. He carefully opened it, extracting a gleaming gold identification card. Walking calmly to the reception desk, he placed the card in front of Andrew. The name embossed on the card was bold and unmistakable. Daniel Blackwood, owner, Magnolia Luxe. Andrew froze, his eyes wide as he picked up the card with trembling hands to inspect it more closely. Rebecca hurried over, bending down to take a look at the card. The moment she recognized the truth, her face turned ashen. "This can't be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silence blanketed the grand lobby. The chatter and laughter of other guests died down as if everyone could sense something monumental had just occurred. Daniel stood there, saying nothing more, his cold gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "I've seen enough," he said, his voice deep and steady, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "What you've just done isn't merely unprofessional. It's blatant discrimination based on appearance and skin color. Is this how my staff treats customers?" Andrew stumbled back a step, stammering, "I didn't know. We didn't mean to." Daniel let out a cold chuckle, his piercing eyes settling on Rebecca, who now stood with her head bowed, her hands clenched tightly as if to hide her trembling. "It doesn't matter whether you meant it or not," Daniel continued, his voice firm. "The issue isn't just individual behavior. It's systemic. A system that allowed this to happen, that made you believe you have the right to decide who deserves respect and who does not." Victor, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke up, his voice subdued. "Sir, we didn't know you were the owner." "If we had known—" Daniel interrupted him sharply, his gaze cutting like a knife. "If you had known I was the owner, you would have acted differently? And what about those guests you deem unimportant? Are they not worthy of respect? Tell me, what makes you think a person's appearance is a valid measure of their worth?" Victor lowered his head, unable to answer. Rebecca, meanwhile, looked as though she wanted the ground to swallow her whole, but Daniel's gaze remained fixed on her. "Rebecca," he said, his voice calm but as heavy as stone. "You are the floor manager. Do you realize that your attitude is what perpetuates these prejudices? You whispered to your staff that I wasn't our kind of guest. Did you think those words were harmless?" Rebecca lifted her head, her eyes red and glassy as she tried to find the words to explain. I didn't mean to. I just thought." "You thought I didn't belong here," Daniel said, cutting her off. "And how many other customers have you thought the same about? How do you think they'd feel if they knew that a place meant to symbolize hospitality was rife with this kind of discrimination?" Daniel's words rang out with a powerful resonance, not just directed at Rebecca or Andrew, but at everyone in the lobby. Guests and staff alike stood frozen, feeling the weight of the truth he had laid bare. Daniel stepped toward the reception desk, picked up his card, and looked directly at Andrew before shifting his gaze to Rebecca and the two security guards. "Today wasn't just a test for you, it was a test for me as well. To see whether the system I built was strong enough to resist the deeply ingrained prejudices of society. And I have to say, you've all failed. But this isn't just your failure, it's mine too." He paused for a moment, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its intensity. "Failure is inevitable, but I will not allow this failure to continue. From today forward, everything will change, not just here but at every property I oversee." Turning to Rebecca, he let his gaze linger on her for a long moment. "You have two choices, Rebecca. Either you accept your mistakes, change, and prove that you deserve to stay, or you leave immediately." Rebecca trembled, nodding silently. Andrew and the guards also lowered their heads, none of them daring to utter a word. The atmosphere in the lobby was heavy, as though a storm had just swept through. Daniel turned and began walking slowly out of the lobby, but his voice lingered behind, echoing in the space. "Change doesn't come from words, it comes from actions, and I will make sure you act accordingly." Instead of leaving, Daniel called for an emergency meeting in the grand lobby. All staff members, from receptionists and security guards to the management team, were summoned. Under the dazzling lights of the crystal chandeliers, the familiar space now felt tense and oppressive, weighed down by anxiety and unease. Standing in the center, Daniel exuded a calm demeanor, but his eyes were sharp and commanding. The incident that had just occurred wasn't merely a mishap. It was a blow to the ideals he had spent his life building. He wouldn't let the silence stretch any longer. "I want everyone to listen carefully to what I'm about to say," he began, his deep, powerful voice resonating throughout the room. All eyes were on him. Rebecca stood in the front, still looking shaken. Andrew kept his head down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The other staff exchanged anxious glances, awaiting their verdict. Daniel recounted the entire incident, detailing everything, from how Andrew and Rebecca treated him to the actions of the two security guards, Victor and Mark. He didn't omit a single detail, including Rebecca's whispered words of prejudice to Andrew. Though his tone wasn't angry, each word carried the weight of disappointment and stern resolve. "What pains me the most," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping over the staff, "is that those of you whom I trusted looked down on a guest simply because of their appearance. What makes you think differences in skin color, clothing, or outward demeanor give you the right to decide who deserves respect?" His words struck like a bell, reverberating through the room. Rebecca raised a hand to cover her mouth, trying to hold back tears. Andrew stood motionless, his hands visibly shaking. Daniel paused briefly, taking a deep breath, then continued in a steady but grave tone. "Starting today, this hotel will change. We will not only change the way we operate, but also the way we think. Every staff member, from the lowest level to the highest management, will undergo training on fair and professional treatment of guests. Anyone unwilling to comply or incapable of change should leave now." He scanned the room, his eyes locking on each person as if gauging their resolve. His voice grew firmer. "Magnolia Lux is not just a hotel. It is a symbol of fairness and hospitality. There is no room here for petty prejudices, discriminatory attitudes, or a lack of respect. If you cannot understand that, you do not belong here." In the ensuing silence, a few staff members bowed their heads in shame. But Daniel knew reprimands alone were not enough. "We cannot change the world overnight," he continued, "but we can change how we run this place. I want Magnolia Lux to be a place where anyone, no matter who they are or where they come from, feels welcome." His voice softened slightly, though his determination remained clear. His gaze swept across the staff, his eyes reflecting both disappointment and hope. "Today I am disappointed, but I still believe we can do better. I believe you can do better, but that depends on your choice. Will you change, or will you continue to repeat these mistakes?" Some staff members lifted their heads, their faces filled with shame but also a newfound determination. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice trembling but sincere. "Sir, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I want to change. I'll do whatever it takes to make amends for my mistakes." Andrew stammered, "I truly didn't realize how poorly I behaved. I'm sorry, I'll change." Daniel nodded but didn't hastily accept their apologies. He knew words must be accompanied by actions, and real change would only come when they deeply understood their mistakes. "Apologizing is the first step," he said, his voice calm. "The next step is proving that you genuinely understand what's right. And I will be watching. I'll make sure no one, no guest, ever has to experience the disrespect I did today." The meeting ended in silence, not the silence of fear or dissatisfaction, but the silence of reflection and introspection. Daniel walked out of the grand lobby, leaving behind a staff team now forced to confront themselves. He understood that the journey toward change was never easy. But the first step, facing the truth, had been taken. With his determination, Daniel believed Magnolia Lux could truly become a place where everyone was treated with hospitality and fairness. That evening, after everything had settled, Daniel sat alone in his office on the top floor of the Magnolia Lux Hotel. The lights of the surrounding skyscrapers flickered through the glass windows, casting a shimmering glow on the ceiling. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but inside, the space felt enveloped in absolute stillness. Daniel didn't feel victorious. There was no sense of pride in how he had handled the situation. Instead, his heart was weighed down by deep contemplation. He thought about Andrew's panicked eyes, Rebecca's trembling voice, and the guards' bowed heads. Yes, they had been wrong. Their behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful. But at its core, the issue wasn't just with them as individuals. It was a consequence of a system that had been in place for too long. A system he, as the leader, had inadvertently allowed to grow unchecked. Daniel knew that change wouldn't come from a single lesson, a meeting, or even reprimands. It was a long process requiring persistence, determination, and a firm belief that people could change if guided in the right direction. He picked up his phone and called Elise, his wife, an unwavering pillar of support. Elise answered almost immediately, her voice gentle yet full of concern. "Are you okay? I know this hasn't been easy for you." Daniel recounted everything, the details, the emotions he'd experienced. From the disappointment of witnessing his staff's disrespectful behavior to the pain of realizing such prejudices still existed in the place he was so proud of. Elise listened intently, not interrupting. When he finished, she spoke softly, but with conviction. "You did the right thing, Daniel. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who has ever been disrespected or underestimated because of how they look. This isn't just about Magnolia Lux. It's about an entire system that needs to be changed." Her words washed over him like a soothing breeze. Daniel knew she had always been the one to see the bigger picture, reminding him of why he started everything in the first place. He stood and walked to the large office window, gazing out at the vast night sky where stars twinkled amid the city lights. He wondered how many people out there had endured the same injustice he had experienced today. How many had swallowed their pain silently because they lacked the opportunity or voice to fight back? Elise continued, her tone growing firmer. "You've done something not everyone has the courage to do. But you know, this is only the beginning. Every action you take, every time you stand up, creates change. Not just for this hotel, but for the society we want to build." Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see him. He felt the warmth of her words, a deep trust she had in him and his mission. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. After the call, Daniel sat back in his chair, looking out at the city once more. He told himself that Magnolia Lux would not just be a luxury hotel. It would become a symbol of fairness, a place where anyone who walked through its doors would feel welcomed and respected. But he also knew that achieving this vision would require facing more challenges. Every action, confrontation, and corrected mistake would become part of a long journey to transform not just the system but the mindset of those within it. Daniel smiled, not out of satisfaction, but because his heart brimmed with determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to walk it to the end. Tonight, under the light of the stars, he felt he had taken another step forward on the path called justice, a path he had always been committed to. And with each step, he believed he was moving closer to a world where respect was not a privilege, but a right for everyone. Thank you for following Daniel's emotional journey here at Echoes of Empathy. If this story touched your heart, stirred empathy within you, or inspired you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to help us reach an important milestone, our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support is not just our motivation to keep going, but also a way to spread meaningful stories about justice, compassion, and human connection. See you in the next story,